In some of the earliest drafts of the Fellowship of the Ring, Bilbo Baggins is married and has many children, one of which would become the protagonist of our story. This part of his life played an important part within the early story of The Lord of the Rings, but Tolkien ultimately changed his mind, and with it, Bilbo's life. In order to understand why Bilbo was never married and had no children in the final version of the trilogy, let us first explore a version of the story in which he is. In Tolkien's earliest view of Hobbit society, it was somewhat common for hobbits to suddenly disappear, sometimes even unannounced, for weeks or months on end until finally returning with a partner. One of the indicators of who was getting married was which hobbits had suddenly vanished at the same period of time, and with that the town or village would be able to tell what was happening. Bilbo's was one of those cases, and following the events of The Hobbit, he would one day go away for a time and return a married man with Primula Brandibag as his wife. They would go on to have many children together, and one of Bilbo's descendants, some years later, was intended to be the main character of the trilogy. Tolkien eventually changed his mind, however, and made the Fellowship's protagonist Bilbo's son, Bingo. In this draft of the story, Bilbo would disappear alongside his wife right before his 11th birthday and not by himself, never to be seen again by the hobbits of the Shire. This would leave his son, Bingo, responsible for the ring, and the events following the celebration would presumably transpire similarly to our own. By the fourth draft of the text though, Tolkien seemed unsatisfied with the idea regarding Bilbo's family and marriage following the events of The Hobbit, and retconned it, switching the role of Bingo from son to nephew, and turning Primula Brandibag into the wife of his cousin Drogo Baggins, while maintaining her position as Bingo's mother. Bingo would naturally evolve into Frodo Baggins, who following the tragic death of his parents would go under the wing of his uncle, previously father, Bilbo. After which the events that we are familiar with would go on to occur. While the matter of Bilbo being a bachelor has been highlighted in the text itself, and Tolkien himself obviously considered the matter during his writings, why then did he ultimately decide against providing Bilbo a family? Throughout The Lord of the Rings, we see detailed descriptions and many similar happy endings for our characters, and so such a thing, on the surface, may not have been uncharacteristic of The Lord of the Rings. Well, while I don't think it would have been uncharacteristic per se, I do think it was the best course of action that Tolkien could have taken, and its effects on the philosophy and themes of The Lord of the Rings are stronger than you might think. But first, in order to understand the subject, we will have to divide it between the literary reasons behind Tolkien's decision, and then how he implemented that literary decision within the lore itself. Starting with his out-of-world literary reasoning, I think the removal of the family elements of Bilbo's life rightfully removed an extra layer of complexity from an already dense and complex narrative. While the main premise of the trilogy is relatively straightforward, where the nuance of Tolkien's world is found is in the details. In what was already developing from the beginning into an incredibly difficult and ambitious endeavor, the additional factor of having to deal with the previous protagonist's family history, status, and future may have been seen as subtracting from the overall focus of what Tolkien intended for the story, without adding anything particularly important to the end result. In fact, when imagining the relationship of Bilbo and Frodo, if they were literal father and son, a beautiful and important part of their story is immediately removed. Whereas a father has a responsibility to his son, and a son may have to suffer the duty of being responsible for the actions of his father, within the final version of The Lord of the Rings we see a distant uncle that has taken his recently orphaned nephew in and given him a home. We see that uncle raise the child, read him stories and educate him, make him the heir and successor of everything he has. And on Frodo's part, of course, we see someone who was pure and ignorant and had no experience of the dangers of the outside world, obtaining the burden of the most terrible object in the world, which he would have to carry on his back for the salvation of the world. We see two strangers essentially become father and son, and earning a relationship that may have otherwise come for granted in Tolkien's earliest drafts. This connection between Bilbo and Frodo is perhaps one of my favorite parts of the books for this precise reason. A man who, while having all of the riches of the world, has no family to share them with, and a child desperately in need of love and affection, leading to one holding on to the other with everything they have. To imagine then Frodo or Bingo being just another descendant of the great Bilbo Baggins or perhaps one of his children, certainly removes a central characteristic of each of those characters, and above all, Bilbo himself, who is the one changed the most because of it. Nonetheless, although within the 6th volume of the History of Middle-earth we're not given any detailed or specific insight on Tolkien's mindset regarding the decision, Christopher Tolkien would go on to comment that the abandonment of the idea of Bilbo's marriage was, in his eyes, inevitable from the start. Now, having talked about Tolkien's potential reasoning on a literary level, how did the professor come to explain his decision within Middle-earth itself? Hobbits are noted time and time again for their family-oriented society and large clans with numerous children. Not only that, but as I mentioned earlier, the fact that Bilbo is a bachelor is not at all glossed over in The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. His fellow hobbits are very much aware that Bilbo is a bachelor and are wondering the same question that we are. Why did he never marry, at least in the beginning? Something heavily implied within the text, and sometimes even said outright by Tolkien himself, is that Bilbo's adventurous Took side, which originated from his mother Belladonna, influenced his perception of life greatly during his youth. As a child, he's remembered to have always been fascinated by the outside world, especially following the visits of Gandalf in the Shire, something which set him apart from most hobbits. For the majority of his early life, and especially following the death of his parents, he would keep this side of him locked deep inside. As Master of Bag End, he developed an image for himself as a very respectable hobbit, following in the footsteps of his father Bango Baggins. He enjoyed this lifestyle for many years, and was known for being a very sought-after bachelor from amongst the women of the Shire. Bilbo himself, however, seems to have kept a certain distance from finally settling down and starting a family, and he always wished to see the wonders of the outside world, even if he did not dare to admit it before an unexpected journey occurred. By the time of the events of The Hobbit, Bilbo is 50 years old, still a decent time to marry for a hobbit. Once Gandalf the Grey and the dwarfs arrive at his door, however, and he vanishes from the Shire for his adventure to the Lonely Mountain, everything is solidified. Bilbo, up to that point, respectable but a bit reclusive, returns months upon months after his disappearance with absolutely insane stories and chests of treasure. From that moment on, while perhaps a local legend for his deeds, Bilbo was perceived as an oddity, as an example to be avoided, and certainly as a hobbit that was perhaps not as right in the head as he should be. Rumors circulated throughout the Shire regarding his adventures and himself, his wizard and dwarf visitors, or his journeys outside of the hobbit realm. In simple terms, he was someone best to avoid if you wish to start a family, as the institution of marriage, as you can understand, was something to be taken incredibly seriously within hobbit culture. You could simply not risk starting a life with someone that hung out with disturbers of the peace, and perhaps even had something shady going on in his life, not to mention the fact that he had miraculously stopped aging. Our suspicions based on the published text are confirmed when reading Gandalf's opinion on the matter of Bilbo's bachelorship as recorded in the Unfinished Tales. I guess that he wanted to remain unattached for some reason deep down which he did not understand himself, or would not acknowledge, for it alarmed him. He wanted all the same to be free to go when the chance came, or he had made up his courage. I remembered how he used to pester me with questions when he was a youngster, about the hobbits that had occasionally gone off, as they said, in the Shire. Thus, Bilbo originally not wishing to pursue a family, and then the Shire not wishing to pursue Bilbo, combined, are ultimately the reasons why this beloved character is shown to have never started a family according to the lore itself, something used to explain, as we saw, Tolkien's different approach at developing the Fellowship of the Ring and the relationships of our protagonists. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.